Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this podcast is perfect for you. Alrighty guys, welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Before we get too far along into this podcast episode, I'm going to take the opportunity to quickly mention our Twin Elements 20k or 20,000 YouTube subscriber giveaway, which we have recently launched over on our YouTube channel. This is now live. You would have seen the video for those that were early onto it last Wednesday, the 26th of March. And if you're joining us now a couple of days to weeks on, then what we have done is we have gone and pinned that YouTube video basically to the Twin Elements YouTube feed. It's like the suggested video when you open our channel. So that should be pretty easy to find. If for whatever reason you can't, there's a massive orange banner at the bottom saying 20k YouTube subscriber giveaway. And there's also called the Bow Hunting Wild Bangtang Boar and Buffalo Bulls in Australia Twin Elements 20k YouTube giveaway. That is essentially how you're going to be able to find it. And then once you do find that video, there's a couple of simple steps. Simply like the video, and then next you need to comment in 25 words or less your dream hunt. So essentially we want to know who it's with, what weapon you're taking, where in the world you're going, and what species you plan on hunting. For example, that could be bow hunting a giant bull moose in Alaska. You know, for James and I, will be with our father, Nick. For you guys, it could be with a mate or someone that got you into hunting. It could be the partner, it could be the kids, whatever it may be. We just want to hear where you're going, what you're doing, and we're going to be selecting at random a winner from the comments list there. Lastly, the winner, in order to be selected, must be subscribed to the Twin Elements YouTube channel to be eligible to win. And obviously, we're going to be giving that away when the Twin Elements YouTube channel hits 20,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is very, as we're happy to announce, nearing, that quite quickly, which is really amazing. It's been a long time coming, but basically, the prize pool includes thousands of dollars worth of gear, which is generously being donated by some amazing brands in the hunting industry, these same partners and ambassadors that have been supporting us for many years now. So this is just a bit of a short running list. We have some gear that has already been lined up from these guys, as well as we're continuing to add to this list. But Atlas Wild, Oz Calf Energy, Dog and Gun Coffee, Day 6, Cayuga Broadheads, Kimbo Knife Sharpeners, Lower Boots, Option Archery, and Venture Hunting and Outdoors are amongst the prize pool with, to be honest, some of the stuff that when I have a look at this list, like the Lower Boots, we're going to be throwing in a pair of Lower Ranger GTX 3s, which are an amazing pair of boots, retailing at, up to $600. That's going to be someone's, set of boots to go and potentially do this hunt over the next couple of years. So there's some really amazing bits of kit. There's an Option Archery, Option Foresight, which I've got running on my bow at the moment, and just the versatility of those, let alone the value of such an amazing product, is an amazing prize package to be potentially won. So unfortunately, this is limited to Australian and New Zealand residents only. But yeah, we're going to be sending one of you home with an amazing prize package. And as always, we appreciate your support. So alrighty, let's get into today's podcast. As you probably have figured out by now, today is going to be a solo podcast, and you're joining me, Ayden Doumtsis, for what's hopefully going to be an in-depth rundown of what processes I go through from basically the seconds following a shot on an animal all the way through until, hopefully that moment I lay hands on that animal. So this is, as you can see, everything after the shot. And it's incredible how many times I've experienced personally, as well as heard of other hunters thinking that they've made a perfect shot on an animal, perhaps celebrated a little bit too early, and then really struggled to find the animal following that shot sequence. I've also heard, obviously, the opposite, and shared any experiences as well, where, I've seen a shot go off, or I've taken a shot myself and thought, oh, that was a little bit further back than I would have liked, or a bit low, or, something along those lines. Just had a bit of ambiguity in terms of not knowing exactly where that arrow hit. only to move a few paces and that animal basically go down within sight, and you think, all right, how the hell did that happen? That was not on my radar. I did not think that was going to be the outcome. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is that hunting is so variable, and with so many factors to consider, obviously in the moments leading up to the stalk, and then obviously the shot. And this is particularly relevant when it comes to, the shots that we're taking on animals. So there's so many factors, from just the shot angle itself, the species of animal, and they're obviously like different anatomy and things like that. Whether it's a bow or rifle, then you've got environmental factors. For example, is it in the hills or is it flat? Is it raining or is it dry? And of course, then there's obviously animal factors, such as, is that specific animal breathing in or breathing out? Is it inspiring or expiring? Has it been rutting? Is it relaxed? Has it been stressed out prior? Was it, chased across the hill by another stag or another boar and bashed seconds earlier, and now it's got, full of cortisol or something like that? So that all, I guess, relates to its level of alertness. And all of these variables, very quickly we'll find out, can all change the outcome of the shot. Even if we think that we've, taken this same shot, whether it be a 20-meter broadside shot with the bow hundreds of times on a feral pig, for some reason they all seem to be slightly different when we go and obviously follow up after the shot. So I've basically gone and taken a bit of a post-shot sort of playbook here, and this is just some factors and considerations that I take into account after every shot, whether I think I've nailed it, done poorly, if it's a 20-meter broadside shot textbook, or if it's a 5-meter front-on shot. Doesn't really matter. These are just a few of the considerations that I obviously, try and have playing through my head as I go to follow up on that animal post shot. We will also be touching on a few FAQs. We've got some specific to this actual podcast topic, which is great. And as always, if you guys have any questions on getting rut ready following this podcast, then please obviously send them into us via the email with subject outline FAQ, and just send those into info@twinelements.com.au, or you can DM either Twin Elements James Doumtsis Outdoors or Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, and we will always strive to get back to you guys. Are you in the market for serious boots for all feet, terrain and adventures? Well, look no further than Lower Boots. We have been running the Lower Ranger GTX3s for many years now without so much as a blister. The team at Lower have extended their generosity to you, our valued listeners, and supplied us with a unique discount code. Use code TWINELEMENTS10 at checkout for 10% off your next order. Wear Lowers on your next hunt. Your feet will thank you. Alrighty, so for today's example, I figure with the rut booming and coming in very quickly, what we might do is just give you guys a bit of a scenario in terms of, for this podcast specifically. So without going too far into shot placement, like in this actual podcast, we'll save shot placement and broadside, quartering on, quartering away, and all different animal anatomy and things like that specific to different species. We'll save those for some future podcasts. But when, assessing after the shot, it is vitally important to consider things like the shot angle, animal behavior and environment, as we've said earlier. And then obviously working out how that impacts on the shot, which has just occurred. So for the sake of today's podcast, let's assume that I've snuck into, 20 meters of a buck scrape. As we tend to see with the fallow rut, let's say that it's one nice mature buck, there's a couple of satellites around and a couple of does with him that he's obviously trying to breed. I was able to take a pretty safe, pretty standard broadside shot, maybe slightly quartering away, like it happened obviously pretty quick when he did finally settle on his scrape. I didn't quite see where the arrow hit the buck, but I did hear a really good smack, typical of, a shot that's either taken out the scapula potentially or gone behind the front leg and hit the offside front leg, something along those lines. But, the shot felt good. Nothing felt, untoward. I did see the buck run downhill after the shot, and a number of other animals, so those does and satellite stags or bucks, didn't really know what was going on. They sort of remained in the vicinity for a couple of moments, and then they eventually ran off in sort of all different directions. So immediately there, there's a fair few factors to consider. We're going, all right, we've obviously got a lot of, importance placed on that buck, but then there's obviously, you've got to start thinking of this as like a crime scene essentially. So what you want to do is sort of work from the way in, work out, and try and really line up your variables as to what's important. So my first consideration in these situations is to always, as a bow hunter, nock another arrow. For rifle hunters, you want to be chambering another bullet. And basically, you want to do this as stealthily as possible. So there's no point, fumbling around, putting another arrow on if your buck that you've just shot is standing there, at 10 meters unaware after the shot, because you don't want to give him any adrenaline or any, means of concern that he's in danger from someone in the immediate vicinity. A lot of the time with the bow, they don't really know what's going on. And a lot of the time, even with rifles, you'll see them run 30 meters and stop, and they'll just stand there and go, what the hell just happened? So this consideration is all, I should just say, very much a do it as best as possible, but always, reading the room a little bit in terms of, I wouldn't be knocking another arrow on a buffalo at 10 meters if he's staring there looking at you and there's a risk that he's going to charge you. I'd just be waiting slowly until he turns his head and faces the other way. And then if he hasn't fallen over, that's when I'd nock another arrow and as stealthily as possible, get a second shot in there to help finish the job. Same goes obviously you see this probably with rifle hunters a little bit better, because a lot of guys do shoot. And then this is probably an important thing for rifle hunters, is just keeping that field of view open. You often see sometimes when there's, a bit of not smoke, but gunpowder or whatever going off, or, the recoil, sometimes people lose the animal in the scope, and that first instinct is to take your head away and try and look. Whereas if you can have a shot and really quickly line that animal up, get another chamber or bullet in the chamber, that's just going to, help you obviously with putting in a second shot if required. Often we hope that the first arrow or first bullet has done its job, but this is just a consideration, especially for those newer hunters. If I don't see that animal go down within sight, and I can without, spooking the rest of the mob or spooking any other animals or adding any stress or anything like that to the situation, I'll always put a second arrow on. And this also leads to my second point, is that in this instant, you really want to be careful of mistaken identity. And this is probably more relevant to animals like pigs and stuff like that in the same mobs, or where, again, it's not the worst case if you do shoot a second animal, but I know that in some, I obviously run the spotted safaris, and I've had now an occasion where two separate chital stags were shot from the same mob because the client had misidentification, thought that the stag that he'd shot was still standing there, put another bullet in and was watching, and then shot a second stag. And it just happened to be that his stag dropped, he didn't see it, and where that stag had run to, another one popped up and he shot that just in the rush of, and adrenaline. Obviously we do things pretty quickly. And in that case, it was very fortunate that he obviously did two really well placed shots and we had two beautiful animals on the deck, but it is and can be quite costly mistakes. And worst case, sometimes it can lead to two. If your first shot on the animal one wasn't great, and then your second shot on animal two wasn't great, it can lead to two different tracking jobs, and then obviously time gets away from you. Meat retrieval gets harder. Just doing justice to those animals gets really difficult. So avoiding mistaken identity is really important in these scenarios. But it also, is one of those things that put an arrow on the string, because I can't tell you the amount of times where I've shot 3, 4, 5 boars from a mob because I've shot the first pig, known that he's gone down. Instead of sitting there celebrating, mucking around, being noisy or anything like that, I've just been really immersed in the situation. The rest of the mob, the silence of the bow, nothing really knew what was going on. And obviously you want to be trying to ensure that the first animal that you've shot is your primary focus. So you want to make sure that it's down before you start shooting second, third, fourth, fifth animals and whatnot. But in the case of feral pigs and stuff like that, where we're often, culling them for property owners and just that environmental damage as well. If you can put a second arrow on and get a nice second shot away and watch that animal go down, there's like nothing wrong with that. And again, it's just one of the first things I do after the shot would be knock another arrow or chamber another bullet.
There's a reason they say, get serious, get Hoyt. Ayden and I have always shot Hoyts, and that's because we're rough on gear. Our bows are constantly getting knocked and thrown around, but we know they will stand up to the test when the time comes. Hoyt has created the lightest, best performing carbon bows on the market. While some people change their bows like the season, I've had my old girl since 2019 and she's still performing flawlessly. If you're in the market for a new bow, get serious, get Hoyt.
I guess my second consideration is pretty simple. This isn't going to be, anything too strange, obviously, but it is amazing how often people get carried away. And that's why my second consideration is simply to remain calm and really observe. So basically, after the initial shot, you just want to remain completely silent, put that arrow on if you can, rechamber another bullet and sit there. You don't have to talk to your mate. You don't have to celebrate, fist bump, do anything. You don't have to jump up and down. You don't have to run over the mountain looking for the animal. You do not have to move. Sometimes just sitting there is one of the best things because hopefully, with a really good hard or long shot on most of these animals, they'll run. Sometimes it's 100 meters in 10 seconds. And if it's in fairly open country, you'll watch them and they run. And then if you're quiet, you're sitting there, you're watching, you'll often hear the animal fall down. I can't tell you how many times this has happened with sambar deer in the high country in Victoria. It recently happened on a buffalo trip where James and I shot this really nice bull at 12 meters, which you guys will see in some upcoming films. And the bull basically did a wide arc about 50 meters, 60 meters around us, crashing through all the scrub, and then it just went dead silent and we didn't make a single noise. We were just sitting there. And to be honest, and then I was kind of getting a little bit nervous because I thought, geez, maybe he's run out of our audible zone. And then there it was, 10 seconds after the shot, we hear this massive crash to the ground, and that was sort of our confirmation, or never confirmation. You obviously want to be have your due diligence and be patient and then follow it up and, go through these steps that we're going to talk about. But that was a massive indication as to that buffalo had fallen down in that general vicinity. So again, the biggest thing with just remaining calm is not, celebrating prematurely, listen for the direction that the animal runs away. Also just watching the sort of behavior of the other animals nearby. So if you sort of have a shot, especially with the bow where it's nice and quiet, that buck runs out of frame or out of view over the mountain, down the hill, and all the other animals are calm and going, oh, what happened? They'll initially jump and run and they might stop 20 meters away and they're looking around. They might be looking down the hill to where that buck just ran. And then if after 10 seconds, they might hear a crash that you can't even hear and they start running, that's often a good sign too that animal that they're watching or part of their mob has fallen over. So, there's so many little cues that you can pick up on here. And the biggest thing is just being observant. This is really, really crucial, and why I've sort of given its own consideration, because it is underrated just how observing during this period here can be really important for later on when we're following up after the shot. So that sort of brings us into consideration 3, which for me follows on very neatly with this, and it's record your thoughts. So we all often have iPhones, whether it's talking to your hunting buddy. This step here is really, really underrated as well because, again, as we said, hunting has so many variables. So I like to make it clear, particularly if I didn't see the animal go down. If I see the animal go down, then I'm probably a little bit more lax on all of these steps. But I do like to take them just to learn from the whole scenario as well. But what I've started doing, especially in the hills, when I've shot something, I did this with my first couple of sambar deer, where I didn't see them quite go down, thought I heard them, all these different things, was kind of looking around going, shit, which tree did I actually shoot that deer near or whatever? Where was he on the game trail? And I've learned a lot over the years of doing this. And as soon as you can sort of assess the situation, that animal's now out of the situation and you are very far into this after the shot period, you kind of start to second guess what happened a little bit. And that's why I think recording your thoughts is great, or at least what you initially thought, because sometimes you'll go through this tracking job or you'll go through periods, you'll kind of actually like forget, oh, did I shoot him there? Or was it, maybe it wasn't quite broadside. Maybe it was quartering on. Maybe it was this, maybe it was that. Was it 25 meters or was it 15 meters? Like, and you start thinking about all these things, and sometimes it's not important, but for some stalks, or sorry, for some, tracking jobs, it can be really important. So I like to just think on, did I think the shot was good? Did I think the shot was back? Did I think the shot was high, forward, low? Did I think it hit bone? Did I hear it go crack? Did I hear it maybe go in the guts? Did I see the arrow hit the stag? Did it run off with the arrow? There's so many different variables. I'll write down the shot angle that I thought it was, which also should tell me things like, does it have an entry and an exit hole? If it was front on, the arrow might still be in the animal, very, very much like within the animal as it ran off. Another thing I'll like to do at this point in time, if I have the benefit of filming, which we often do here at Twin Elements, which is really a luxury, is I'll like to watch back the footage. And as I said, this is obviously the best thing about filming our hunts, because we get to go back and it's almost as if the camera is like a bit of a third-party referee, and we just get more input on all of those variables as I discussed. So, I like to write down which direction it ran. And then what I'll start doing is actually, this is again with social media and photos and everything being on the camera phones these days. I like to take some images of exactly where I'm standing, what tree I'm standing at. And then from my perspective, where the animal was standing, I'll often, take a photo and I'll draw a little dot. All these sorts of things are super important. I might even take a video of me talking to the camera, saying this is where I was standing, this is where that stag was, I think he was 23 meters away, blah, blah, blah. And just record all that information, because it really does come in handy later on. Venture Hunting and Outdoors is Australia's premier hunting retailer. Venture started from a team of passionate hunters with the mission to give Australian hunters the resource they deserve. Through community events, top quality gear, exclusive deals, and expert guidance, Venture is more than a hunting store. It's a community. Check out their incredible mega store in Brisbane today, or head to their website to shop all things hunting and outdoors. The next consideration, I think we're up to number 4, is it's sort of, this is a bit of a decision now. Do you assess basically like what's the strategy? Are you going to wait some time, or are you going to go in for an immediate follow-up or tracking, like essentially? And this is very much largely dependent on, was your initial thought that the shot was good or bad? Is it late in the afternoon, early in the day? Is it super hot, super cold? There are so many, again, factors and variables here. Like if you're in the Northern Territory and you've just shot a buffalo for meat, then you can't really wait too long, because obviously the longer that the animal is sitting there laying in the sun, potentially dead, potentially not, the longer that meat is going to, have the opportunity to go bad and spoil, and then obviously recover less. The same goes for, is it getting close to nightfall and you've got to drive 3 hours, it's the last afternoon of your hunt. Unfortunately, these decisions and factors do actually have input on our strategy. But my biggest thing is, if you think the shot was good, then still give it a little bit of time and then go in. If you think the shot was bad, then definitely give it a bit of time before going in. If there is any doubt, then often be more hesitant than confident would be my only thing, because as we often find with the experience, the worst thing you can do when blood trailing an animal is actually bump it and give it that adrenaline spike, because it often leads to us not finding it, or that animal going from 100 meters away and bedding down or being there quite sick to potentially kilometers away and in a different postcode, and really difficult to then obviously get a subsequent shot in or find deceased from the shot. Consideration 5 is super important. I like to record not only my shot location, so the exact location where I was standing when I took the shot, but also the suspected hit location. So what I'll do, this is where, again, like we've hopefully taken those photos earlier on our iPhone with like our perspective or point of view as to where we were standing, where the deer or the animal was standing. What I like to do before I even move anywhere after the shot is I'll actually then get my phone out, which I run a lot of GPS apps on and things like that, or anything where you can basically start a map and do a drop pin. I'll do that, and I'll simply write, like shot, for example, and then that way it's a definitive location that I can always go back to, because I can't tell you the amount of times you look around and go, oh yeah, I'll be able to come back to this point, especially in the Samba Hills, when you're hunting like these sort of open ridges where there's a bit of tea tree and whatnot, and you think, yeah, no, I'll be able to come back. I shot him just off that game trail and it was by that big gum tree. And then you walk 30 meters forward to where you think you shot him and you look back and you go, holy shit, which tree was that? Like they're all big ironbarks or they're all big gum trees that you're looking back at. And it's amazing how then you kind of walk back and you look back and you're like, I'm in the wrong spot and now I don't actually know where the stag was standing. So the more we can get these variables and these things in concrete, evidence, the better. So yeah, I like to record exactly where I was standing when I took the shot, as it helps to try and obviously piece things together later on. What I'll often then start doing is start a tracking feature on my phone, which is going to be our next consideration, but that's just so that I now have a definitive like drop pin saying where I took the shot from. And then from this moment until I find the animal, hopefully every step that I take is going to be recorded as a tracking feature. So I'll basically then move over to where I perceive that the animal was standing, and I'll put a second drop pin down saying hit. And that's where you're obviously going to start, looking for blood and tracks and things like that. But before we do that, as I said, consideration number 6, I really like to enable that tracking feature on my phone as well, because what this does is this is going to essentially be, it's great. If you don't have to use it, then it's amazing. Like if you end up going 20 meters past, where you think you hit him and you're just over the hill and there's a nice Samba stag laying there, then absolutely amazing. You just turn your tracking feature off. But where this tracking feature can be really, really effective is, say you've gone and done a bit of blood trailing, you've gone for 100 meters, and you're following initially a bit of a spatter of blood, and then it drops to pin drops, and then eventually you're on his running tracks, and then nothing. Say it rains and you lose his tracks or his blood or whatever. At least you have this grid or this tracking sort of line as to where you've walked. And if you're over the next day, if it's cool enough weather and you're really determined to obviously find this animal, which we all should be, you can go and rely on this tracking feature. Sometimes I've gone and I've looked absolutely everywhere, and then I'll come back to a site, years later, and I've found animals dead where I thought I looked, and it's purely that I must have missed them in thick bush by like a couple of meters, or simply not looked into a specific, little blackberry thicket from the right angle, and I've missed it. But what you can do, and this is where this tracking feature is extremely important, is I'll often do as much due diligence walking around, do all the reasonable things as to where I think the animal's gone, do all the tracking. And then sometimes I'll just start in a little simple grid effect. And especially if you've got a couple of mates with you, or, you bring your dog even, you can really thoroughly go over an area and go, oh, geez, there's a tennis court sized, area that I didn't actually check here, sort of in the middle of my search quadrant. I'm just going to go back over there and check it. And there's a fair likelihood, if you think, especially you've done a good shot, that stag is dead or that animal is dead within 100 meters. But you can genuinely miss them, especially if you keep going to thick bush on the side of a steep mountain and you think, oh, I'm just going to take this game trail and go around it slightly, but I'll look at it from the other side. You might miss the same spot 5 times, whereas at least with the tracking feature on your phone, you can go, no, I've definitely walked through that. There's a line going straight through that bush, or, I'm satisfied that my tracking feature shows that if that stag was dead where I've been, I would have seen him. And again, that's just a really great peace of mind, and it's so easy. You just simply enable tracking feature on your phone, on your GPS, whatever it may be. So consideration number 7, I think we're up to now, is where as I alluded to earlier, we are sort of, when you've shot an animal, you want to go and establish that crime scene. So right now is where we're going to try and find the evidence. And I like to think of this as a bow hunter, for me, as essentially I try and find the arrow. If I can't find the arrow, it's the animal's tracks or the first bit of blood. So they're the three main things that I'm looking for. If it's a rifle, it's probably less obvious to find a projectile or things like that. But what you want to be looking for is obviously like the animal's tracks or blood as well. And again, from those earlier bits of information where we've taken, a photo or a video of the perceived shot, especially with rifle, if you're taking cross gully shots, I'll sit there and on my phone, I'll get my, phone out, take a photo, and I'll say, yep, near that big rock pile up there, something really identifiable. Because if it's a blackberry gully, when you get over there and you're in amongst it and the topography changes, you're not going to know which blackberry bush looks, anywhere different. So another good thing is to even sometimes find out, do a drop pin on your side, and then with your rangefinder go, yep, I shot that stag at 100 meters with my rifle across the gully. And if you know where your drop pin is, you should be able to go across the gully and then range back to, the other side of the hill and go, yep, this is 100 meters. It might just help you find that initial site as to where the animal's running tracks are or that first bit of blood, because especially when you've got to go down and up and, get to a cross gully shot with the rifle hunters and you're not finding like an arrow sitting there etched into the ground, it can be really hard to find, a track or a drop of blood if that animal's taken off into thick scrub. So these are the three things that I obviously try and find. And then, as I said, we'll try and match these with my images from earlier and try and work out where that should be. And to be honest, if I've shot most of the time at like a broadside animal and I've done the, shot mark as a drop pin, hit mark as a drop pin, and then walked over to it, normally pretty quickly by the time I get there, I look just beyond where I think that animal was standing and I'll often find the arrow sitting there in the dirt. Like often it's a complete pass through, which is great. We obviously put a lot of confidence in our gear, in our broadheads and arrows and whatnot, and obviously love being able to resharpen them and all that type of stuff. And that's why when we get like a complete pass through, it's great. But I personally actually run white Fletchers on my archery gear, on my arrows, because I want that arrow to basically tell me every little bit about the hit site. And we'll get into this a little bit later on, but I'll spend quite a considerable bit of time looking for an arrow, obviously not walking over blood or animal tracks and things like that. So that's the thing, when you get towards this hit site, you want to be, as I said earlier, like at a crime scene, not introducing any new dirt, any new footprints, any new tracks, anything. Don't bring your bow and backpack over and just slump it down on the ground. Everything needs to be pristine because you want to be able to come back to this site as meticulously as possible, repeatable as possible over the next, could be an hour that you're trying to find this animal. And this should be your spot that you can go back to reliably and find that first bit of blood or first track or first whatever. And what I'll like to do is, once I do find, that first bit of blood, I'll often mark it or I'll often drop another pin on it or whatever it may be. So we're just trying to find that evidence as early as possible, because that's going to give us, one, the satisfaction of going, yes, we did hit this animal. We have shot at this animal. Now we have to do our due diligence and find it, because there's nothing worse than when you can't find any evidence and you think you've shot an animal and then you're sitting there going like, why is there no arrow? Why is there no blood? Why are there no tracks? Like, he couldn't have just, Houdini'd it and disappeared. So the other thing, you might not find any of these arrows, blood, tracks or anything like that. But what you can start looking for is, areas such as broken limbs or broken logs, any debris that's crashed where the animals crashed through. It might be, sometimes game trails are the best things. You really need to go through and with a fine tooth and comb, really pick apart this crime scene and try and, as a forensic investigator, essentially try and find exactly where, this first drop of blood is going to come from, because you really don't want to stampede over the initial blood trail as you move forward, because the tiniest little bit of like blood on a leaf, especially the way it falls and the way that that droplet sort of lands on the leaf, can really dictate and change whether or tell you whether that animal's running a certain direction, or if the blood trail is going to sort of go a slightly different way from what it has been as well. So there's so many different things to sort of obviously think about here.
Atlas Wild helps to fuel your outdoor adventures. My personal favourite is the peach iced tea in the Rise, which is caffeinated and keeps you ultra focused while on the mountain. The electrolytes and B vitamins in there prevent muscle soreness and means that you can back it up on these extended hunts day after day. We've teamed up with Atlas Wild to get 10% off your next order by using code TWIN10. That is TWIN, 10 the number, to get 10% off your next order. Head to their website and shop today.
As part of this sort of looking for evidence, one thing to consider, especially with the bow hunters, if you can't find the arrow or blood, this has recently happened to me with a chitaldy hunt, for example, where sometimes the arrow will remain within the animal and it's run off with the arrow. And sometimes that can actually act as almost like a bit of a plug and prevent any blood from spilling out, especially with those high lung shots. You see it quite often. Or if, the entry has gone in and there's no second exit hole, and that arrow is sitting out one side, there might not be very much blood actually leaving the thoracic cavity, for example, and that animal can still be, lethally shot dead on its feet, running, 50 to 100 meters very quickly in a couple of seconds. But you might not find any blood. And there are so many differences when looking for blood trails between, a 2-blade broadhead or a 3-blade broadhead. I can't tell you the amount of times that I've shot, really thick-skinned animals like buffaloes or boars with a 2-blade broadhead, and they've been dead so quickly. They've run 40 meters and they're dead, and you could not find a drop of blood because they're really thick, leathery skin, or their fighting shield on a boar literally just closes that 2-blade hole up straight away. The arrow passes through, but then the thick skin and gristle will just cover that hole, and you might not find any blood. But that's the benefit of hunting sometimes in that open country. You'll see them go down, but that's where it's particularly important, especially for animals like sambar deer. And I definitely have found this with rifle hunters as well. Not that I have heaps of experience as a rifle hunter. I'm not going to lie, I primarily hunt with a bow, but I have guided plenty. And what I have found is that a lot of the chital deer that have been shot and that we've had trouble finding are the ones that don't drop on the spot, and they run a certain distance into bush and we don't see them go down. And it can be really, really, really difficult finding blood with, certain hollow points, especially when they're going through and they're expanding and they're not punching out the other side. They're doing their job. And often with rifles, that you're obviously relying on that, percussion effect and trying to knock down animals rather than them hemorrhage and bleed, such as what you're doing with a broadhead. So these sort of things can be, seen obviously with bow and rifle hunters, and that's why it is really essential to set up your crime scene and try and find the evidence. The next consideration, hopefully we've been able to find some blood after getting to the hit site, and that is actually assessing the blood trail. So, some things to start looking for. Again, with after the shot, everything just comes down to being super observant, super aware of the situation, and just trying to take in as much information as possible. You really are a forensic sort of investigator in this instance. And again, I said earlier that I really personally love to use, white fletched arrows specifically for this reason. I know a lot of guys like to use, bright red, bright yellow, bright whatever, just because it makes finding the arrow easier. Whereas for me, I couldn't care less. If I shoot one animal with one arrow and it breaks or I lose it or whatever, it's never nice. But if I can find that arrow, and especially with white fletchers, I can then go and really assess the blood trail. I just find that so much more valuable than being able to look in long grass and go, oh, yep, there's my yellow fluoro fletchers, but I can't really read a blood trail off it that well. And that's not always the case. A good blood trail is often a good blood trail, but it's more for those instances where you get one tiny little bit of drop, or maybe it's not even blood, maybe it's just some gastrointestinal contents, or all these little things. So that's where assessing the blood trail is extremely important. You want to be asking yourself questions, for example, like, is there any meat or muscle? This is relevant, obviously, to rifle hunters as well, because sometimes you might hit something far forward and you've got more meat or muscle and there's no blood. There's no blood, it's just muscle. Is there any gastrointestinal contents? Is there guts? Does your arrow smell bad? Is the blood bright? Is it dark blood? Is there bubbles in the blood? That can be obviously like a great sign. If there are small little bubbles and the blood's quite frothy, then it's an indication that you've hit the lungs, and that's something to cheer for. But if there's not, maybe that gives you something like, a little bit of hesitancy and doubt to sort of proceed too quickly with the blood trail. What's the volume of the blood? Is it single droplets or are there puddles of blood? Like it could, someone that's colorblind just go, oh, yep, there's a really good blood trail here. Assessing sort of whether it's spraying consistently as the animal moves or if it's just dripping down the leg as the animal sort of walks gradually, can be two different things as well. Because if every time that animal, I'm sort of doing it here, but if you can imagine that animal moving its front leg forward and back with both front legs and in its stride, and it's just every time it opens its leg forward and extends, it's just spraying out blood, then that's going to be a lot better than, that animal just filling up internally. And then as the animal sort of walking along and that volume is filling up within the thoracic cavity, hopefully it's just dripping out through this little hole, then, you're going to have two totally different blood trails there. So another thing to consider here would be what I really like to look for, especially as a bow hunter, is the blood on both sides of, the game trail or the area that the animal's running down the hill. So essentially, you want to be able to read from that, is there an entry hole and an exit hole? And 2 holes is twice as good in the sense of, blood trailing, just because it means you've got an entry and an exit. The animal's got 2 different ports that it's bleeding from. It should lead to a faster and quicker kill. Not necessarily kill, but a much easier trail to follow. Like you should, in theory, have twice the amount of blood, just as one hole, because it's so much easier for one hole to be plugged up, obviously, with the effects of that arrow still remaining in there. And that's where it can be really important factor when blood trailing. Another thing to consider about the blood trail that can often give you, like you might have thought, oh, did I hit that animal a bit high or whatever, is sometimes just the height of the blood on the actual trail itself. Like, is it all on the ground, indicating that it's, splattering out from a certain area, or is there even blood smeared on the brush, at shoulder height? So you can sort of get different indications, and sometimes having a bit of both is really good. So it doesn't necessarily mean anything either way, but it can just help give you a bit more information into the whole aspect of blood trailing. So the next consideration, I think we're up to consideration 9 now, is assessing the blood trail. So my biggest rule is that once I have a blood trail, I don't leave it. And as I said earlier, I'll often use that tracking feature on my phone so I can go back to it and sort of see where I've walked, and hopefully it's on the trail especially. And hopefully if there's, if I do have to go back and go, oh, where was that trail? I can always go back to that tracking feature. But what I'll do is I'll also drop pins and just say good blood drop, blah, 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 because sometimes you might, with that tracking feature, take 5 steps to the left and then go back to the right and then do a couple of steps, and the actual trail of where the blood trail can be a little bit misleading. Whereas if you've sometimes got, say drop pin for the shot, drop pin for the hit, and then drop pin 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 that are all on blood, you can actually start getting a pretty good example and line as to where the next blood trail or blood splatter or whatever might be. And sometimes that's a really good indication. I will say that, with blood trailing, there is definitely a bit of an art to it. I think being really thorough and really patient is important. Like, as I said earlier, it's super easy to be a bit hasty and think, oh no, I'll just go a little bit forward ahead and think, the animal's probably just over the lip there, I'm just going to go a little bit closer and have a look. But it really can be detrimental. And this is especially evident when there are 2 hunters. And I can't sort of say this enough or stress this enough. It gets super, super, super important, especially when there are 2 hunters, to basically like create a chain of command, I guess. And if you're the one that shot the animal and you want to blood trail it and you're doing it, then really rein that other person in and just get them. Sometimes if it's, someone that I'm taking out hunting, I'll just say, boys, sit there, or whoever it is, just sit there, have a drink. I'm just going to start this. And then if I need to tap out, I'll call you over. Otherwise, I just don't need 3 people walking around stuffing up my crime scene, essentially. So when it comes to like assessing the blood trail and following it, one person definitely needs to take the lead and the others need to be patient and follow. When I find blood, as I said, I'll do a drop pin, mark in the exact spot where it lies, and this just helps to track that line of, trail or movement as the animal has moved, which I said. And then I also like to sort of leave visual cues, such as, whether it's flagging tape. I've even used toilet paper because it's obviously biodegradable. There's surveyor's tape, there's different ropes, strings, whatever people might use. You obviously want it to be quite visible so that you can see it. I like to tie that stuff, if I do use it, up at like head height, so that especially if you're going through like undulating topography in the mountains or the hills or whatever, and you're going up and down banks or whatever, it drops off a little bit. If you're tying it down where the blood is on the ground, it can get really hard to actually see your line of travel over, meterage, especially if, you got one drop, 10 meters, one drop, 10 meters later. Whereas if you're tying it at head height, it's a lot easier to look back, even if you've dropped down the ridge a little bit. If that tape's at head height, it's a lot easier to look back and go, oh, yep, that's where my last blood was. And then look up at the ridge behind that. Yep, I'm still traveling in a rough line, because animals will often like to take, the path of least resistance, as we'll chat about in a second here. But one of those big things when it comes to, like synthetic man-made tapes, obviously, and, any material that we take into the bush, whether it's rubbish, food, whatever, it's essential to obviously remove it from the bush. So after the tracking job is completed, hopefully we've found our stag, boar, whatever it may be, you really do need to go back, grab all of this surveyor's tape and remove it, because there's nothing worse than, going through the bush, especially if it's on public land or anything like that, and you go and see where other people have been and they've left their shit in the bush. So even if it's helped you find your animal, then please just be considerate and obviously take it out of the bush. For this reason, I often won't pack any of that type of stuff, just because, by the time you do find an animal, you do try and do the meat retrieval and stuff. I'm not going to make excuses. You do sometimes forget it, and there's nothing worse than it. But that's why I find that toilet paper, as I said earlier, it's biodegradable. It can be really good, and it's white, so it's quite easily seen. You do have to just be considerate that in rain or heavy wind or anything like that, it can obviously be blown off course. Which is why, again, like as a fallback to all of this, I like to do 2 or 3 things, and I'll have that drop pin and the tracking feature on my phone anyway. So I'm not ever really sort of going without one thing or the other. Like I do take my blood trailing very seriously. Originating in Texas, USA, Numa Outdoors has formulated a durable, breathable, quiet and comfortable camouflage lineup for all terrain, seasons and pursuits. You may have seen us across our socials running the new Renegade lineup in our recent Northern Territory adventures. That's because the Renegade lineup is perfect for early season, hot and humid conditions in the heat. We're pleased to announce that the Numa camouflage lineup is stocked exclusively by Venture Hunting and Outdoors here in Australia and available now. Head to their website to check out the whole range today. So we've sort of just spoken a little bit there about blood trailing, and obviously if you've got pitter patter and things like that, then it is easier to follow a blood trail, whereas sometimes, they're not always going to be the perfect blood trail. So the next consideration number 10, is searching for the blood trail. What I like to do if I have no sign, no evidence, maybe I've got an arrow and then I can't find, any blood, or maybe the arrow's in the animal still, I'm assuming, because I couldn't find it. I started on some running tracks to get me on a game trail maybe, or sometimes all you will actually go off is where you think you hit the animal and where you last saw it. And that can be good enough sometimes to help you get started. So searching for the blood trails, I like to look for game trails and the path of least resistance. You've got to think, if you've just been shot personally, you're standing there, you're not going to be trying to run through walls to get out of your house. You're going to be running down the corridors and through doors. And that's essentially what the animals are doing too. They're running, along game trails, downhill most of the time. So this is a massive thing. Anything that's mortally wounded, I often see run downhill and take the path with less brush. They'll also, as a general rule, seem to try and follow the other animals in the mob. And then to a degree, they eventually will sort of peter off and expire or bed down just slightly off where the other animals were running. So sometimes even following or knowing where the other animals have run, they are mob animals, a lot of the animals that we do pursue. You just want to be careful that you're not getting mixed up with following, all the animals, and then your animal's just snuck off to the side and you've walked past it and then winded it potentially, because that can be one of the worst things in terms of, successful outcome for these stalks, especially on those marginal or borderline sort of shots as well. So another thing to think about is that different mediums have better or worse blood holding qualities, I guess. So if you're hunting in really sandy country, like creek beds and things like that, and you're trying to look for, the single little drop of blood on a dry creek bed, it can get really, really difficult. Whereas if you're hunting up north in the Northern Territory and this animal's run across, under some gum trees, and they've got those really dry, broad, gum leaves that are often like that crunchy brown sort of texture and color and whatnot, you're going to have a lot better time trying to find blood trail on those really dry, broad leaves, because one, the medium is going to hopefully catch it a lot better compared to even sometimes blood trailing first thing in the morning on dewy, wet, fine grass stems or something like that, or whatever, can be quite difficult. So you've just got to keep that in mind. If you're on really good blood and you've found blood and it's easy to follow, then that's great. But sometimes we walk too fast for what the actual medium can hold. So sometimes you will, as you get out of potentially the edge of a paddock where you've shot this deer, it will literally be a speck of blood, a speck of blood, a speck of blood, a speck of blood. And then as soon as it gets out of that short green, clover field, for example, or where there's really wet, green, short, green stems, I guess, of grass, and then into maybe some dogwood, you might find that the dogwood is absolutely smeared and you're like, oh, yep, now it's like someone's got a paint roller and just gone across the whole dogwood and you can follow that track. But it might have taken you 20 minutes to cover 20 meters in the initial part. So just be mindful. Obviously, if the temperature is really, really hot and dry, sometimes blood trails will dry up pretty quickly, and this can be relevant up in North Queensland, and it can be sometimes difficult to go, is this sap on a leaf or sap on a branch, or is it blood? And you don't get the benefit of, feeling it and seeing if it's, sticky and still blood, or if it's really watery or whatnot. And then the same obviously can be said if it's super wet and raining. It can be obviously a nightmare trying to blood trail stuff in the rain because your evidence is just disappearing in front of you. So that's where, being mindful to be quick and efficient is one thing, but you again don't want to be missing things by being hasty. So there is a lot to go into searching for a blood trail. Being able to try and touch and feel blood can be really good as well. If I've sometimes used toilet paper on a leaf or something and gone, is that blood? And dabbed it with the toilet paper, because the toilet paper and that white sort of cloth, I guess, or fabric is really good at showing you at least that, yes, this is blood, or no, it isn't. Sometimes it's just dirty water. Sometimes it is blood. Other things such as, fallen logs and debris, as I said earlier, can be really great medium for catching droplets. I can't tell you the amount of times that you haven't found blood and you're on a game trail and you're like, I swear these are the tracks of that deer. I swear these are the tracks. I just can't find any blood. And then as soon as that animal gets to especially a fallen log, and you've almost got to acknowledge it as a dressage horse competing or jumping over some jumps, and you can imagine the energy required to leap over that little log or something that's on the path. Not only does the big broad log and its grey bark or whatever act as a really good medium to see blood, but also the act of jumping over a log can be a really good spot for that arrow or gunshot or whatever to reopen, particularly if it has closed, or particularly if it's only dropping tiny little drops of blood that you're missing. It might just reopen and pump out a heap of blood or splatter out a bit of blood that's been pooling now in that thoracic cavity. So again, consideration number 10, as we said, searching for the blood trail. There's so many different factors. I think just be slow and methodical. If you aren't sure, then obviously try and go back to your tracking thing. And I do like to look down, look up and go, okay, where do I think the animal is going to go? And you obviously don't want to put too much emphasis into where you think it's going to go. You want to be looking at where the last blood was, and then often looking a step further from that. Yep, a step further from that, a step further from that, and getting the blood. The last thing you want to do is, when you're searching for a blood trail, is go, oh, there's a game trail 5 meters away over here. I'm just going to bypass everything here and walk straight over to that. Consideration number 11 is what I consider to be the most important point of a blood trail. And these are those blood trails where it really is testing, like you're following things, and it's kind of, you start getting a little bit nervous, to be honest, at this point, because a lot of the time, even if you thought an animal was shot really well with a bow or bullet, does not make a difference. You're kind of in the back of your mind going, geez, I've been traveling for a little bit further. And that's where sometimes when you're looking at the ground, it can actually be a bit misleading. Whereas having that on your mapping feature, the hit site, sometimes if you tap on that and it says, oh, you've only traveled 35 meters in a straight line, even though your track as such might feel like you've been winding around for 100 meters, if that makes sense, like your foot patter has moved 3 steps that way, come back to the trail, 5 steps that way, come back to the trail. It might feel like you've been walking for ages, but then by hitting that drop pin, sometimes it's 30 meters and you go, okay, sometimes a deer, even with a heart shot, will travel 100 meters quite easily downhill. So what we're about to talk about now, as I said, is what I consider to be the most important point of the blood trail itself. And that's when you do have like a consistent blood trail, because often an important point of the blood trail is like the first drop of blood, because it gets you on that point. But this is what I'm talking about specifically, is when you've been following the blood for a little while, and then what you want to do is essentially look for a spot where the animal stops and stops running, basically, for the first time after the hit. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. So a lot of the animals, when we shoot them, they go, oh, like what the hell was that? And they will run. And a lot of the time, animals, especially if you've heart or lung shot them, they will just run and then they will die mid-stride because of oxygen deprivation. Sometimes it's with the bow, it's obviously hemorrhage and loss of blood, and that blood volume is obviously carrying the oxygen to the tissues and everything like that, and the vital organs. So again, it's a combination of things, but with a heart or lung shot, it's super evident as to the first time the animal stops, because that's where the animal's has died. Where it becomes really important is if you identify this spot that I'm talking about of the blood trail, and I think people that have done a lot of blood trailing will identify that this is definitely like a thing. And what you will see is, it'll be splatter, 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 splatter for 100 meters sometimes. And then you'll get to a point and there might be like as if someone's just sat there for a second and poured out like a cup of blood, for example. Like it will be noticeably more blood than what you've been following. And you might be on a really great blood trail, but then it gets to the point where the animal has consciously stood there for a second and gone, I don't think anything's chasing me anymore, like hopefully. Why am I feeling this way? Do you know what I mean? Like that's what, again, anecdotally, that's what I'm assuming. Geez, I feel a bit sore. I feel a bit weak. I'm a bit tired. Whatever they're feeling, geez, I feel stressed. Is that something coming for me? Like there's so many different thoughts and things that could be going through these animals' head, but there's definitely a point in the trail where they've run, trying to escape that danger of the initial shock of being shot with either a bow or an arrow or a bullet. And then eventually at a certain point in time, they stop. And often at these points, you'll see like a pooling of blood, and it might be 5 mils of blood. It might be 250 mils of blood, like a cup worth. It could be anything, but it's a noticeable like increase in the amount of blood on the trail. And why this is super important is because basically you got to think that like two things are happening here. Like this is the way I like to think of it, is that it's hard, but the animal has stopped, and then if they're no longer there in that vicinity, that they've continued on to their path of safety on their own accord, if that makes sense, through conscious decision making. So, geez, I got hit by an arrow at point A, I've run 100 meters, and now I'm sitting at point B for about 10 to 20 seconds, just listening. Nothing's going on. I can't really hear anything. I'm a bit tired, but I'm going to keep moving away because I think, as far as I can get from point A is better. To me, that sometimes can be a bit of a cause for, you still might have lethally hit that animal. But what I want to say is that if that animal moves past that point, the shot might not be as good as you initially thought. Because as I said earlier, normally when an animal runs from point A to point B, even if it's 100 meters and they're dead at point B, it's a hard or lung shot. Whereas sometimes it'll get to what I was saying earlier. Like the second thing is some animals will run from point A to point B, the exact same as that situation I said earlier. And instead of moving on from it, they'll actually like maybe move 5 meters past it or just slightly off the actual trail that they're on, and they'll bed down. So this is where it's super important, because they've made a conscious decision to basically rest up. And often this can be caused through shock, like hemorrhagic shock, where they're losing significant blood volumes. And you've obviously been tracking them, following this blood that they're losing. That will cause, severe issues such as organ failure and things like that, shock. And these animals are quite often to bed down or eventually die. And sometimes by the time you've blood trailed them, they'll be dead meters from this first spot. So the reason I'm saying be super mindful when you find this spot is because, as I was alluding to earlier, if you find this spot and the animal's not dead right there, I really like to look around quite a bit, try and see if you can see where the trail sort of continues as well. Because if you can get an idea of, okay, it's moving to my 3 o'clock from here, like they've stopped at point X. Oh, yep, I can see that game trail. They've continued on the game trail, or there's no blood on the game trail. Oh, but there's a little bit of blood going here to that thick berry bush up there, or that thick blackberry patch. The animal might have gone up there to just bed down, and it could be dead, might not be dead. So it's super important, because if an animal continuously pauses after the shot and then has the whereabouts to continue, if that makes sense. So if you get to a spot 1 and it's after the hit and there's a massive pool of blood, and then you see it, pitter patter and for another 50 meters, and then there's another pool of blood, and then you see it pitter patter for a little bit, and then there's another pool of blood. It's often because they've stopped and sat there for some time. And if that animal's not dead right there and then that's where, again, I start questioning how good was my initial shot. If you get to that first spot and you go, oh shit, the animal stood here for a second, and then as you're looking at that spot, the wind swirls, or you got to that spot and you had to bush bash a little bit through some dogwood and you hear an animal run off, again, not good, because you've probably bumped an animal that was sitting there ready to die. So that's where assessing the blood trail on the way to this spot can be really, really important as well, because again, if it was a heart or lung shot, by the time the animal gets to this important spot of the blood trail, as I'm trying to allude to, then most of the time they should be dead on their feet by the time you find this pool of blood as such. There often isn't a pool of blood because the animal's dead. They've succumbed to the effects of that shot. So if they're not deceased, there is a chance that they're not hit as well as we would have liked, and they've, moved further away. And unfortunately, as that sounds, that is a point to consider. And this, obviously lets us start thinking about shots that are too far forward, too far back. What could have happened? Was there a deflection? Was it slightly quartering away and I thought it was broadside, or was it slightly quartering on and I thought it was broadside, or whatever? What we have to take into account is that often what we perceive as hunters to be a lot of blood that we're following on a trail, the perfect analogy, and I know James and I love our analogies, is that, we do a simple little paper cut, you can fill up a couple of tissues very quickly with blood, and it's a tiniest little cut. Like, it's honestly not even relevant as a cut. Like, the initial hurt, yep, got me. You sort of forget. If the blood wasn't there, you wouldn't even realize you were cut. Think now to an animal that you've shot through the vitals, potentially. They can lose so much blood so quickly. But even when we look at the pool of blood on the ground, and hopefully the blood trail that we've been following, we want it to be as good as possible. We want, like great blood trails, obviously. But as a general rule, at most large animals that we're hunting have, about 10% of their body weight as blood. I think it's about 8% is probably more accurate. But just for the argument of today, let's say that, like a 100 kilo boar has about 10 litres of blood. Losing 1 litre of that blood would be significant. Like, that would be causing, likely death, definitely shock, all these types of things. So to think of that though, if I was, this is where being the vet and having that background comes in handy for sort of assessing blood trails and things a bit more objectively. Like, for me to go, oh, that's an amazing blood trail, I really need to see a lot of blood now, because I can see when I work as a vet and you draw up medication in, like a 1 ml syringe, and if I was to grab 1 ml of red food dye and squirt that across the wall, it would look like a murder scene. Like, it would look like the wall is just covered in blood. And 1 ml of blood in the grand scheme of things for a sandbit deer is nothing, even though it can look quite significant. So when I used this example just before of a 100 kilo boar and then potentially having, 8% accurately, so 8 litres of blood, it could lose 800 mils of blood before it goes into shock and death, if that makes sense. So that's a lot of blood, 800 mils. You got to think of, your Nalgene bottles. If you were to spray a Nalgene across the ground, that's a lot of, especially when it's red and obvious, that's quite a lot. So again, the only reason I'm mentioning this as my a key consideration, I think we're up to number 11, and the most important part of the blood trail for me is because if I find it and that animal's not there, then I'm going, okay, what has happened? Because in most instances, the animal should be dead at that point. If it's stopped and it's not dead there and then it's continued, for me, that's a conscious decision of that animal to stop and then continue moving. Whereas often an animal that's heart shot or lung shot doesn't consciously stop and then run off again. Like, they just run and then die. You literally see their legs fall out from under them. So knowing that, and as I said, knowing this is an important sort of consideration, can be really important for the next few things. So as I said, if I'm then starting to get a bit of doubt and go, okay, what's going on? Where is this animal? I'll slow my stalk up. Sometimes from this point, I'll go, I'm going to sit for half an hour, and because that animal could be right there at that next bush. It could have kept moving and be miles away too if you've, hit somewhere else. But the realistic thing is that when we've shot an animal, especially if we think we've done a good shot, and then we get to this point, they're often not too far away. And I can't tell you the amount of times an animal has been right on the blood trail dying as I've got there a couple of minutes later, and it's never nice, but it's one of those things that you just do not want to get to this point, not realize it, and then bump that animal because it has really drastic ramifications, I guess.
We all know when it comes to great tasting coffee in the outdoors, look no further than Dog and Gun Coffee. But the same great tasting coffee can also be enjoyed in their whole bean variety in the comfort of your own home. Rounded out with their incredible hog chockey, Dog and Gun has something for everyone. Use code TWIN10 at checkout for $10 off your first order. Discover your brew of choice today.
Following on from the previous consideration, my next one would be just focusing more on shots that are too far forward. So all I really want to do for this is sort of maybe touch on a few of the characteristics that I tend to find. And this, again, is probably coming more from a bow hunter's perspective, but I definitely have seen it similarly in rifle shots, where people have been aiming for the point of the shoulder or whatever, or even sometimes the base of the neck as rifle hunters, and they've hit in their shot too far back, but it's too far forward of the actual heart and lung vitals, if that makes sense. So when we look at most animals and you count, their ribs, it starts at the base of the neck and will exceed all the way back to, obviously their diaphragm and everything that separates thoracic cavity and abdominal cavity. Their heart and lungs are very far forward, often behind the front leg. So in that 3rd to 6th range in most animals is where their heart will sit. And then their lungs obviously are bigger, triangular shaped, that are sort of taper from the bottom where the heart is more up and back, I guess, is sort of the anatomy of the lungs. And it's pretty easy to go and check what it looks like. There are many diagrams and things like that. But essentially, if you miss that and you shoot too far forward, what we will often see is you'll often hear like a pretty good crack, because you're often hitting, front leg, whether it's scapula, humerus, one of the bones in there. You could be hitting vertebrae of the neck. You could be hitting anything. You might not hit any bone, but you might be hitting arteries or veins that run off the front of that, the legs there, basically. So it can still be an extremely lethal shot, even if it's not the shot that we intended. But what I will say is that you do often see, as I said, quite high volumes of blood. That blood is usually quite like bright red and really thick. You often, I guess, lack the bubbles that you see in a lung shot. And sometimes if you think, oh yeah, I smoked it, there's a really good blood trail, but then there's no bubbles, I'm going, did I actually hit the lungs, or like, did I, and especially if you kind of following this trail going, there's a lot of blood here, and if I heart or lung shot it, it should be dead here sooner than what I've found it. Like maybe you have traveled 100 meters and you still haven't found that animal. I would be going, maybe I actually hit a little bit far forward. And if you can rewatch footage or do any of those things that we said earlier, like ask your mate if there's someone else there, or revisit back through your, the notes that you've written down, and go, was it definitely broadside, or was it maybe slightly quartering on? Because I might not have got much peno, or I might not have hit the heart and lungs, and I might have actually just nicked an artery. And again, nicking an artery is never good for the animal, but there are definitely like instances where that animal could walk kilometers and survive, or walk kilometers and then be lost, obviously, and die. So the other thing, I guess, to be looking out for when assessing like these front-on sort of shots, or shots that are more forward cranial of where you intended, is that sometimes there's more likely to be like meat or bone fragments as well on the trail, and that can sometimes be seen as, those rifle shots where you've busted bone or meat or whatever, and then it is often evident like on the trail. And these animals usually run quite a distance, say about 100 meters, and as I said earlier, with that pooling, they will stop and there'll be quite a significant amount of blood. And then they'll often like go have that conscious decision where they're not lethally hit, or they're lethally hit potentially, or quite mortally wounded, but they do have the conscious decision to be like, geez, my leg is actually really sore. Like, what's that sticky stuff dripping down my leg? They'll probably smell it. They'll probably get a bit of fear. They might even hear us coming down the trail behind, or they might hear us celebrating, or the other deer in the mob might be barking at us now because we're not being calm. We're not, thinking clearly. We're celebrating and mucking around. And they might get a bit of an adrenaline rush and start moving off again. So that's where these front-on shots, or if it's, shot too far forward of, the heart and lungs, these animals will often have that blood pool after, say 100 meters, sometimes it's 20 meters, sometimes it's 200 meters, and then they'll continue. And what we tend to find is that blood trail will often go from like consistent to really quickly like starting to reduce and become more of like a splatter. And then from a splatter becomes droplets. And then from droplets, it becomes unfortunately no blood trail. And then you're sort of sitting there going on game trails and trying to track deer based on their running marks. And eventually, often the case, it'll go to nothing. And there's nothing more, I guess, devastating than that. But that just sometimes is the reality of those shots that are too far forward. And that's why the last thing you want to do is get to that blood pooling area and then rush it, or try and get a second shot into an animal or something like that, and not have the opportunity. And often these animals that we've hit too far forward, they are sore, but if the arrow or bullet hasn't hit and entered into the chest cavity or the thoracic cavity, and it's only like a superficial nick or like a superficial, injury, say the shoulder or the neck or something like that, then these animals can in fact survive. They do often get, I'm not going to, dilute it. They do often get infections. They do often die after. So it's never good wounding an animal. But it is more likely that these animals will just continue on with life. And I've definitely seen and heard of people shooting, red deer, and then they've disappeared in real thick bush for a week and then come out a week later and they're sort of recovered from that shot that they got. It was just a marginal shot, a bit far forward, didn't get much peno. And you see it with elk all the time in the US, people shooting elk and they've got, broadheads or something like that, or bullet wounds in certain parts of their bodies. So those front-on shots, as I said, quite high volumes of blood, often quite bright red, and you think, oh yeah, this is really good blood, but there's no bone in it, or you might start, there's no bubbles in it, and you might start finding like a bit of meat or bone. So we've spoken about shots that are too far forward. I guess the next one is obviously going to be shots that are too far back, and that's probably our 13th consideration here today, is that when a shot is placed too far back, so these are talking about commonly what we call those gut shots or gastrointestinal shots, obviously, the blood trail can be quite minimal, and often rather than like a reddish blood that we're used to, sometimes it can be like a darker browny sort of purplish blood even, and it's often a different consistency. Like it's, as I said earlier, with the shots that are shot too far forward, sometimes they're a bit thicker, like it's a not meatier blood, but like it is thick, whereas these gastrointestinal shots or shots that are a bit far back, even if it's through the liver, can be a little bit like watery to a degree, and similarly to the animals that are shot too far forward, often they'll run a distance away from the shot site, let's say 100 meters, just to keep it consistent. But what will happen here is these animals that are shot too far back and they've been shot through, the liver or the gastrointestinal system or whatever, anywhere back of the lungs and heart, these animals will often actually bed down or get to that spot where they've stopped and there's a pool of blood, and they'll move slightly off it and they'll bed down or they'll die right there, but it often takes time. So what we've got to acknowledge here is that they've been shot in like a major organ system, which is the gastrointestinal system or the abdomen as such. It's like, you hear of humans getting shot in the guts and they bleed to death, or they literally sit there and they can't move and they die. They're found in shock and all these types of things. And that's because in that gastrointestinal system or the abdomen, you've got to think that there's all these important organs such as the liver, the kidneys, obviously like the stomach, all these different things. There are so many different blood vessels and stuff in there. And sometimes, obviously, even if an animal is shot further back of the lungs, or even if it's even I guess you could consider a lung shot where you get one lung maybe shot a little bit far back or something like that, or you just didn't get the penetration. Again, obviously that animal that's lung shot and you've only got one side of, say it's the left-hand side lung, and the arrow, pulled up before getting to the right-hand side lung, it's often going to die. Like they're dead. They're going to die, but then it takes longer. They might travel 100 meters and pull up. So if you're finding blood, or not finding blood for that matter, and then you start finding really dark watery blood, or you find your arrow at the beginning, and that's where like stacking these factors, as I've said earlier, can be really, really important. Because say you get up to where you think you should have a blood trail and you find your arrow and it's got green grass matter and a bit of like blood on it, I would be sitting down for half an hour minimum up to hours. And I don't know, I'd be calling your mates and looking at the weather and going, hopefully it's not going to rain. Like all these types of things. I might back out sometimes, and if I'm on a hill, back out and glass that whole basin, thinking like I'm just going to watch, anywhere I can see to make sure this animal doesn't like walk down and out of the basin or something like that and up over a ridge. Because sometimes like they might die like a day later. Could be such a prolonged period of time. It really can be unfortunate. But what you do also have to consider is that these shots, when the animal does take time to die, again, it's not nice, but does give us time for a second shot opportunity to end that suffering and put the animal down as humanely as possible, often trying to make up for the situation that we've got ourselves in. But one thing that's incredibly important is that you want to make sure the wind is right when you're doing that, as well as that basically that second shot is more important nearly than the first shot. If you can't do it properly, then you're better off just letting, as bad as it sounds, letting the first shot take its effects and that animal die. Because if you bump that animal a second time after the first shot and it gets adrenaline, then it's effectively as good as saying, goodbye, and you lose that animal. It goes and dies anyway. A pretty sad death, obviously, and then you often lose the meat and everything like that as well. Obviously, the trophy, if it's a trophy, which like the meat and antler and hide and everything is to us anyway. Like, we hunt for so many factors, but the biggest thing is like that meat, unfortunately, is going to be lost. Like, you might find the head 5 days later when you find a gut pile or something like that, but the meat and the precious resource that is the meat and stuff is going to be gone if you do bump that animal. So that's just a bit of a consideration about those shots that are too far back. One of the biggest takeaways with this, if you think you've gut shot an animal, don't be too quick to follow up the trail. Obviously, do all the steps that I've discussed earlier. And sometimes you'll think you've shot something too far back. I've definitely had this with boars, and you've hit the liver and they're actually really quickly dead. And again, sometimes they'll only go 50 meters, 70 meters, and they'll bed down and die. And there might not be much blood or anything like that, but they, definitely will be dead at the end of that trail. So always do your due diligence and track these animals, because we just owe it to these animals after the shot to be putting in the effort to know exactly what's happened. So that sort of brings us into consideration 14, which is when to call it. And again, this comes down to the individual, as much as I hate to say it. I know some guys that will shoot an animal and go, "No, I missed it," and that is it. They won't even go over to that side of the mountain and look for blood, which is really not acceptable in my eyes. And that goes obviously all the way to guys that will, could be on a hunt that they've paid lots of money for, and they could easily, the guide sometimes goes, "Nah, mate, you didn't shoot, you didn't hit it," and they've gone over, looked for blood, and then they'll spend the next day looking for blood. There's just so many different variables and different levels of, I guess, investment and ethics in these sort of things as to how much people will look. But I guess calling it at the end of the day is a personal thing. And some things I like to consider is obviously, as I said earlier, just stacking that evidence. A lot of animals will run downhill when wounded. So even if I think I've lost all the evidence, I've done a few laps and all this type of stuff, I look at my tracking feature on my phone and I'm start gridding. Maybe I'm doing, I'll walk 100 meters, I'll take 5 steps to the right, and then I'll walk back where looking at my phone, obviously, to make sure I'm on the right line. And that the track is, effectively covering a bit of a grid. But then looking at the ground, making sure you're not walking over an animal or into any bush that an animal could be hiding and stuff. So gridding is one thing that I'll often do before I absolutely give up a search. Another thing to consider is that a lot of these animals that run downhill, there is another saying where animals that are, hit will often run to water, because as their blood pressure drops and things like that, they often want to replenish their volume of their blood and things like that. And that's done through drinking. And obviously this is again, a grain of salt needs to be taken with all of these things, because this might be days later. It's an animal that's initially hit is probably just going to bed down and try and stem the bleeding as such. They're not going to be walking 3 kilometers to go to a dam because they're like, "Oh, I've been hit with an arrow and my blood pressure's dropping. I need water to survive." That's just not a conscious thing that happens. But it is something where there are a lot of animals that are wounded will be found dead or alive near water in the coming days. So again, as much as I hate even saying it, sometimes leaving the site and coming back the next day or days later is the only scenario that we actually get. So sometimes, again, you might have shot something in the morning, you've looked all morning for it, and then you've got to go to work that day. And then the next chance, if it's shift work or whatever, the meat might be buggered. If it's cool, hopefully it's not. But at least you can get closure and try and find that animal. Sometimes coming back with the dog. I know people have used dogs to track where it's legal and whatnot. Obviously, all these sort of considerations are outside of what I'm talking about in this podcast, but I'm just trying to give you guys some hints to obviously get closure on the situation, because sometimes, as sad as it is, using smell and odor a week later to find a carcass can be something. And at least you get, as I said, like you might not get the hide or the meat or anything like that, but at least you know that animal died, you know, maybe it's 100 meters from where the shot was and you just couldn't find it in thick scrub. So, you know, birds such as crows or any raptors or anything like that, like eagles and stuff, circling an area is pretty vague, but it can also be a giveaway of, you know, some of these locations. But yeah, sometimes just, you know, it doesn't work. There are some animals that we lose, unfortunately. Like I've definitely, as I said, found animals years later that had died less than 100 meters from where I initially shot them. And it was just in thick scrub or the terrain or whatever, or it rained and I lost the blood trail. And then years later, I found them. So, yeah, hunting in general can be really humbling. The biggest thing is obviously just trying to stack all of these considerations, as I've discussed, to give the animals that we've shot the best chance at being found. OzCaff Energy helps you power your passion. Designed to be convenient, discreet and portable with rapid energy absorption, these caffeine pouches are centered around adventure. With added benefits such as 0 calories and 0 sugar, what's not to love? Use code TWINELEMENTS for 10% off your next order. The last thing I'll touch on for this podcast, or our consideration number 15, is to learn from your mistakes. And it goes without saying, hunting is a steep learning curve. I think it's in our best interest to always try as best as possible to learn from our mistakes. For example, if you rushed a shot and then you go on a subsequent really hard blood trail, you can't find the animal, maybe you did shoot it a bit far forward, or you rushed from thinking it was broadside and actually shot it quartering on because you didn't assess the situation properly, again because you rushed the shot, then all we can do as hunters is make a conscious effort to, you know, relax more next time and be less lustful. We don't always have to shoot something. That's the biggest thing I try and stress to people, particularly people that are learning, you know, this lifestyle, is that sometimes just watching an animal and having an interaction is the best thing. We definitely do not have to shoot everything to have a successful hunt. And letting an animal walk and not forcing a shot is the best outcome for a hunt in a lot of instances. So another thing I would say, especially as, you know, a vet and someone that has hunted for a long time, even before I was a vet, obviously, is that learning the anatomy of these animals that we hunt and understanding where like the arrow needs to be or the bullet needs to hit, in order for us to like shoot these animals for a clean, ethical and humane kill is absolutely essential. Like, there is no point being like, oh yeah, someone told me that this is where it is, and then never doing any research on it, and someone saying, yeah, the heart's there. Or, you know, I've heard it millions of times, yeah, I shoot my deer just behind the crease. And it's like, what is the crease? That is such bullshit. Know exactly where the heart lies on a chital deer if you're hunting chital deer. There are so many YouTube videos out there. There are so many anatomy videos on, you know, deer and all these types of things. And better still, my next thing is that I would encourage everyone, if you shoot a pig and it goes well and you see that pig run 20 meters and you're like, I think I shot that through the heart, go and confirm it. You know, pop your gloves on if you have to. Get someone else to cut it up if you have to, if you're hunting with someone else and you're squeamish. But like, even if you don't eat them, and this is, you know, in the case that, you know, you're one of those people that love hunting but you don't eat it, which I just don't understand, but know exactly where the heart and lungs sit on the animals that you hunt and what bone structures your arrow or projectile or whatever it may be needs to avoid to make the shot like lethal, for example. So if you go, okay, as I said earlier, the heart in most animals is sitting in the bottom third of the thoracic cavity between ribs 3 and 6. Okay, I'm going to go count the ribs, go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep, so that's where the back of the heart should be. That's where the front of the heart should be. I'm going to cut under the front leg, reflect the front leg off that thoracic chest cavity, and then cut through the ribs. You might have a little bone saw, flip it open and go, yep, the heart's right there. Oh, it's actually a bit more forward than I thought. It's a bit more low than I thought. It's a bit higher than I thought, whatever it is. Oh, okay, and then the lung overlaps that. I actually shot the top of the heart and the bottom of the lungs. Oh, a little bit far forward. If I shot back, it's actually the lower edge of the lungs because the lungs sit more higher. And again, I'm sort of rattling all this off, but it just sits there like as a vivid picture in my mind, again, because I know the anatomy now. So another thing might be not even to look at the organs, but what legs, like bones of the leg, you need to avoid, for example. Because for me, with my bow, I know I can shoot through the scapula of a buffalo, no problem. But the second you start talking a bit about the bone that's a little bit lower that joins onto the scapula, which is the humerus, and you start thinking, one, it's a bit low, so you can sometimes shoot the humerus and still hit the heart, or deflect up and hit the heart, for example. But if you're hitting the humerus, most of the time that's below the elbow, or like the elbow as such, I guess, and it's actually not a lethal shot, and you're not going to get any peno, and you might sometimes get heaps of blood because you might have hit a little artery in the leg, but it's not a lethal shot. And just knowing what bones like protect the heart and the lungs and the chest cavity, and sometimes just a rib bone on a buffalo might be, half an inch thick. Knowing what your arrow setup does on these different shots is extremely vital. And not just arrow setups, obviously projectiles. You want to make sure that your projectile goes through the meat, muscle, bone, vital organs and everything, and sits just under the skin on the far off side. Do you know what I mean? So go and look, go and be curious, go and explore, cut these animals up and do a bit of, forensic work, especially if you're taking the meat, like do all that anyway. But if you're not, which is, again, I think a poor excuse. If you're shooting like a deer, for example, take as much meat as you can. It eats amazingly. But at absolute worst case, get your hands dirty, roll up your sleeves, go and learn where you need to be shooting these animals. If you're going to be a hunter, you need to be proficient, and that starts with knowing the anatomy as far as I'm concerned. So, obviously, as I said, the animals we hunt deserve to have the best gear and preparation going into each hunt, just basically so we avoid losing animals. So that's making sure that before we even set feet in the bush, that we're shooting at targets readily. Our broadheads are shaving sharp. There's no point being able to put an arrow in the right place and then having blunt broadheads. So all of these little things, like if you're, again, not getting the results you want, the biggest thing is just being accountable, and consideration 15 is that learning from your mistakes, as I said, and just having a hard reflection as to, we actually spoke about this. We had a great listener call in, I think it was 2 podcasts ago in our FAQ sort of questions one, and he said, look, I think I'm hitting animals a little bit far back. I don't know why. And we posed the question to him, are you concerned about shooting animals in the front, through the bones of the front leg? And that subconsciously might have been something that he was thinking, because we often hear, as I said, shoot them in the crease just behind the front leg. And if you start looking at the anatomy in these animals, when you do that, and when you shoot behind the front leg, and not in the bone, accounting for lower poundage or mechanical broadheads or whatever the factors may be, you drastically reduce the heart, drastically reduce some of the lungs, and start playing on liver, lung shots, like back of the lungs and gut shots. Do you know what I mean? So again, he was great and was accountable and said, hey, I'm not enjoying where I'm shooting these animals. I'm potentially losing a few animals. Can you guys help me out? And that just comes back to, obviously we want everyone to be critical of their methodology, critical of their gear choices and things like that. Ask us all the questions you can, but also join clubs, become a proficient archer, hunt with people that are more experienced than you, and you can make it up to them in different ways. Do you know what I mean? You can pack out all the meat, even if they shoot all the animals as a start. Just learn just is the biggest thing. And if you are someone that really struggles from buck fever or getting excited and rushing and placing poor shots, then just relax. I think, as hunters, it's easy to, share our highs quite a lot and then not reflect on the lows, because we're often the only ones that see it. But it simply isn't good enough, obviously, as ambassadors of, humane, ethical hunting and stuff like that. We need to be doing a better job, obviously advocating for ourselves and advocating for these animals that we should be respecting and hunting.
If you're sick of having dull knives in the kitchen or whilst out fishing or hunting, then check out the Kimbo Rolling Knife Sharpener. Its easy design means anyone can have knives razor sharp in minutes. Australian owned and backed by a 90-day money-back guarantee, it's a perfect gift for anyone that loves cooking or in the outdoor space. Use code TWINELEMENTS15 to get 15% off your next order.
Alrighty, so without further ado, that pretty much wraps up our podcast for today. I am going to touch on an FAQ, and for today's FAQ segment, It was actually sent in today, or plucked, I guess, from a hunting group on Facebook where I saw this question asked. And as always the case on Facebook, there were hundreds of comments and everyone was chiming in with different answers, which was quite interesting. But just the backlash of like answers and member bashing was quite significant as well. But again, I'll just say that if anyone has a question that they want answered, please send us an email to info@twinelements.com.au with the subject line FAQ, and we'll strive to obviously answer that firstly, and then if suitable, try and share it to the greater audience, as we do find that these questions are often quite repeatable. We do get them asked quite a lot by other people, and hopefully by answering them in this capacity, people will be able to have their questions answered here on the podcast and potentially not have to like send them in. So we do find that there is great overlap through, what you guys are sending in is that other people do want to hear it or have thought about it at least. And I guess the other way to get FAQs to us is to send us a DM to either, like Twin Elements on Instagram, or Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, or James Doumtsis Outdoors. And again, we'll strive to obviously answer them and get those back to you. But this one, as I said, was from that member on Facebook, and he said, I hit a deer a little further back than what I would have liked, and when I finally found him, he was a bit gassy. Is the meat safe to eat? So obviously these sort of questions and cases, I guess, are a bit case by case based, and there are so many variables that we don't know about. For example, my biggest one here would be what time of year it was and like what temperature it was. For example, if you hit a chital deer a little bit far back and then in the morning and you can't find it till that afternoon, I would near say that meat is inedible, and it probably nearly have maggots on it by that point. It's ridiculous how quickly it can all happen up there in the heat and humidity. Whereas, again, if you shot, again, being a bigger animal with like a sambar deer, it's going to have more gut matter and stuff like that. But you might shoot it in the snow, for example, in Victoria. So there are so many different variables. What I will say is that if in doubt, certainly don't ever take the risk, especially when considering like there are risks of, bacteria overgrowth and things like this, as well as meat spoilage through heat. However, it should be said here, and I will definitely say it because I'm a massive advocate for trying to take as much meat and stuff as we can. We do definitely have a certain responsibility in trying to harvest, the meat from the animals that we hunt, and especially give some respect to the animal's life that we've taken. So, this fella, he's obviously gone and taken the shot and he's trying to acknowledge and take the meat. What I would do is, rather than just say, oh no, it's a bit gassy, I'm not going to take anything, is, especially because it's quite normal for the gastrointestinal tract on, big animals, especially like deer and stuff like that, to expand and get gassy rather quickly when there's like what we call gut stasis. So when that gut's not moving, and especially when they're not chewing their cud and doing all this type of stuff, and then you add in other conditions such as they're laying on their side dead, and the temperature's increasing, like the gas is just going to build up. So it does have the capacity to become gaseous quite quickly. I'm assuming in this question that it was found on the same day. Ideally, hopefully, after a couple of hours of searching, maybe we'll just assume that for the moment, because again, there's a bit of information lacking. In this instance, personally, I would avoid taking any of the cuts that are directly touching the guts or internal. So anything that's intra-abdominal, intrathoracic, anything like that. Anything essentially that's had contact with the internal organs, which are going to be very hot, gassy, and potentially start having build up of blood gases and things like that, and potentially like not toxins as such, but just have contaminants in there and higher levels of bacteria and things like that. So what I would do is I would probably start and quite carefully try and remove the back legs. They're obviously going to be removed through those ball joints. And what you do have to be careful of is if the guts are quite gassy and protruding a little bit, your knife work's going to be really careful. You also will be severing like the femoral artery, or like saphenous veins or whatever in there, in that sort of groin area, and just try not to get as much of that blood that's going to pour out on the meat as possible. So again, remove the back legs, and then I would be getting that hung and in air as soon as possible. I would probably then remove the back straps as well. If I'm being honest there, that's probably all I would be taking. I'd be trying to take, and essentially as well, in this circumstance, I'm just thinking if I take 2 back legs, 2 back straps, that's probably majority of the meat on an animal in most instances anyway. And you can do that in most cases when you're fairly skilled in minutes. Like I'd say most people can do both back legs and back straps in like less than 10 minutes. And that's not being a stretch. Like a sharp knife working quickly, you can definitely disarticulate that back leg, get it on a meat bag, disarticulate the next leg, roll it over, blah, 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 get the back straps very, very quickly. And you've got like a large portion of meat. Again, none of that should have been in the actual abdominal cavity or in the where the organs and gas is quite hot and stuff like that. So what I'll then try and do, and this is me just thinking about trying to be as quick and efficient as possible and then saving as much meat, because you're thinking you're ticking against the clock here. With those cuts of meat, what I would do is I would chuck, I'm assuming there's probably going to be flies around because they've probably been attracted to the dead animal for the last hour or two. So I would have everything in game bags, ideally hanging in a dry, cool place, hopefully by like a creek or under a shady tree or something like that. The back straps are going to be pretty much fine as they are. I would just have them hanging, ideally in separate bags and hanging. And each leg, what I would be doing, especially if I've got plenty of game bags, is I would set up on a game bag or a bit of a tarp, like a workstation, and I would be getting that bone out of that meat, because you got to think with these big back legs, especially an animal like a red stag or a sandbitty, that back leg might be 20 kilos. So you've got from the outside in, it might be like 5 to 10 centimeters of meat until of like hot meat, essentially at this point, hot being room temperature or like external temperature. Obviously, like when that animal died, it was 30 odd degrees, and it's going to cool down slowly. But the longer it's been, 1, on that animal, and then 2, the bone retains a lot of heat because you got to think of it being inside that meat. So what I would do is be cutting from basically the knee to the ball joint, and then cutting around that bone and getting it out. And then from that meat, I would then be going in everywhere there's like a little bit of like a sinew or a fascia. I would be breaking down every single cut of meat in those back legs. And it takes minutes, if that, to quickly go, there's my rounds, there's my rump, there's my, whatever else it may be. All these cuts that you think of at the butcher, and each cut's got different uses. And I would be putting those in individual game bags, and again, hanging them as quick as possible in a shady tree while I'm working on the next cut or the next cut or the next cut. And then as soon as possible, I'm getting that in my backpack straight to the car, where ideally I've taken the care to either have a car fridge or get an esky with meat, with ice, destined for this meat type of stuff. Or if you're hunting at home or at a friend's house, in a cool room or in the fridge or whatever it is, the last thing you want to do is be chucking that in the freezer or something like that. You want it to still cool down slowly, but you want it to be in cool conditions as it cools down. Again, obviously, if you're backpacking and this happens, then like it's against you, but you want to be keeping it in a cool, dry place. The fact that it's off the bone, off the animal, all these types of things, it's going to be having a lot better chance. And just to answer the question, like, you basically want to be smelling the meat, looking at its color, consistency, all this type of thing as you're doing it. Like if I cut that first back leg and I'm sitting there going, this doesn't smell right, this consistency of the meat doesn't look right, like it's a weird, that it's like the meat, when it gets like hot, gets like this greeny sort of paley white color sometimes, like it's pinkish rather than like a nice bright vibrant red. That would be a concern to me. Sometimes you can trim it, and again, like I might be removing the whole leg going, I don't know if this is good, I don't know if this is good, and then as I go being like, oh no, I'm actually like happy with that as it starts cooling. Or as soon as you get it away from the body, sometimes it might come back to being like a usable bit of meat, if that makes sense. So I think, as long as you're not going to get physically sick from doing it or anything like that, like it's, as I said, it's only been dead for a couple of hours, hopefully in the shade, all these types of things, I would be trying to make the most of it. But definitely don't, go against your gut in the sense of if it smells or you think it's bad or whatever, you've done your due diligence and just learned from it. As I said earlier, whilst it's disappointing, it's not worth getting sick from. And yeah, moral of the story is even when things go right, like you heart and lung shoot something, if it's in the tropics or North Queensland where I do a lot of hunting, or the Northern Territory for buffalo and their big animals, meat can go bad especially quickly. Even, you know, if you've shot something and watched it go down and you're working on it from the moment it's down to, you know, an hour after, and you're hunking 40 kilo back legs away. So, you know, there is a potential, you know, capacity here for this to have been, you know, not worth it, and stuff like that. But I think without trying, you're never going to know. So again, yeah, thanks to that fella for putting himself out there and obviously trying to learn from it. Please, everyone, if you are on forums and Facebooks and things like that, let's just try and keep the infighting and bickering and bad comments to ourselves, I guess. I think just always trying to put yourself in other people's shoes. Like, he's obviously acknowledged that, you know, it wasn't the best shot, but things happen. But just the fact that he's trying to learn from it, I think is great. So there were a few people bashing him on social media there, which is, I guess, always the case. We do get these heroes and stuff, but let's just try and obviously, which is the goal of this podcast too, with James and I, we work pretty hard behind the scenes here to try and make this as informational and informative as possible, to try and, you know, obviously paint hunting, bow hunting and the great outdoors and all these pursuits in the best light possible, because it is such a great avenue to have, you know, a great lifestyle and fulfillment. So without further ado, I think that will wrap this podcast up for me. There are so many things to talk about more, I guess, in the future, and this is just a bit of a Kickstarter in terms of things to do after the shot. And hopefully, even if, you know, you can be an experienced hunter, I guess, and just go, oh, I've actually never had the tracking feature on my phone enabled when I do most of these things, or I don't do half of them because I don't see the value in them, but that one tracking feature could help me, you know, find one deer or one pig or whatever it may be, or doing the photo at the beginning of my after the shot and going, that was that tree, and, you know, or from as a rifle hunter, yeah, I shot it by that rock on across the gully, and then when you get over there you go, oh, this is definitely that rock because I'm looking at it now and it's just the exact same as this photo, and then, oh, there's the first blood. If that helps one person, this podcast has obviously been a success. So yeah, thank you all very much for listening. As I said at the beginning of the show, we have obviously kicked off our 20,000 YouTube subscriber giveaway, and it is now live. So please make sure you guys head on over to our YouTube channel, find the pinned Bang Tang Boar and Buffalo highlight reel from the NT adventure, and go through all of those steps to enter. It's as simple as liking, commenting, and subscribing, and you will be in the draw to quite literally win thousands of dollars worth of prizes from some of the most generous brands who support us. You know, some of the things up for grabs are a pair of lower boots, a sight, an option sight from Option Archery, a dragonfly knife from Day 6 Gear. We have some amazing care packages from each of the following brands, including OzCaf Energy, Atlas Wild, Dog and Gun Coffee. All of those guys have hooked us up with some caffeine supplements and hydration required to fuel all of your adventures. We also have a knife sharpener from Kimbo Australia, as well as some amazing gear from Venture Hunting and more. We're actually continuously adding to this giveaway. So as you guys listen to the podcast and as we near on that 20,000 subscribers, we will be adding some more awesome gear to that bundle. So thank you very much, guys. The initial support for that has been amazing. We're seeing all the comments and stuff flood in. But yeah, hopefully someone's going to win that and yeah, have an amazing use for all that gear with their dream hunt, as they said in the giveaway. We have also recently launched our Twin Elements website. So as part of this, we've made our prints available. These are quite literally prints from all our adventures from the wild, and there are over 40 amazing images to choose from currently. Please show us your support. We do honestly love seeing the orders come through and then knowing that, you know, our artwork, things that we've taken a lot of time to obviously capture, edit and then sort of, do all the presentations and things, throw this website together, to then know that they're ending up in people's offices, homes, all these types of things are amazing feedback and something that we are very, very proud of. So thank you again for your support there. They do make amazing gifts for friends, family, colleagues, whatever it may be as well. They're very tasteful. So those are great. Please check them out. Please continue to subscribe, review, and rate this podcast. It's growing like crazy, which has been amazing. Even if you have to, recommend a friend, that's probably the best way to do it and get people onto the podcast is just, hey, Tommy, I actually saw, have you heard about the Fallow Rut podcast from the boys at Twin Elements? Like, did you know about this, and this? That's how we're finding that, it's spreading the most. We have seen people posting our content on Facebook groups as well. I know there's like Bow Hunting the Rut and Hunting Australia and all these different Facebook groups and online, which are great and have some amazing, obviously promotions and things like that. And just, we've seen people sharing our content on there saying, get a look at these guys, go and listen to what they do. So we really appreciate it. Honestly, from us, James and I, we are simply just trying to, promote bow hunting and hunting here in Australia and international, I guess, for that matter, in the best light possible. And we see that as educating other hunters just from our mistakes. Essentially, if you think of us as good at anything, it's just learning from our mistakes. And we have made plenty over the last 25 years of hunting. But it is a steep learning curve. And that's why hopefully through sharing and being honest and upfront about all these things, it just helps the next generation of people that we're obviously keen to see their adventures and success and stuff like that. Hopefully they just succeed where we have as well, and really round out hunting in general. Like it's been really awesome seeing a lot of the feedback. The next couple of episodes of this podcast are set to be really, again, educational. And this is because these are something that we get asked a lot about. So we're going to be diving next specifically, it sort of follows on, I guess, from this after the shot sort of concept of today, into meat care itself, butchering and then eating wild game, and just some considerations and thoughts regarding that. Then we're going to jump into a following podcast after that, where we're going to discuss basically diseases in wild game, focusing on specific diseases of venison and pork. So obviously a lot of people, there's a certain stigma attached to wild game, specifically pigs, and people say, can't believe you eat feral pigs, blah, 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 blah. We're just going to help, obviously discuss that. And then, because as vets, again, I feel like we're pretty well versed to sort of know a little bit about these zoonotic diseases, simply meaning diseases that can be spread between like animals and humans and transmitted, back and forth in some instances. But we also want to just talk about how we can reduce these risk factors and make sure that these high value protein sources in the form of like red meat or pork or whatever are safe for our families and friends to eat, because we obviously love eating it, but processing it, cooking it, and then consuming all these products is super important as well. So that's it from me today. Thank you very much for your support, legends. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope you guys learned something from this podcast. We'll catch you guys next time.